I will recommend, Peter Schwartz has an excellent, I think it's a small book on, self-interest in foreign policy, which I highly recommend. And I think it's available. I think you can get it on Amazon. If not, you can certainly get it through the Ayn Rand Institute. But it's a small book on kind of the principles of self-interest as applied to foreign policy. So I've articulated a few that came to mind. I've attempted a little bit of a kind of a hierarchy to it, presenting in a hierarchy. And then we can talk about applications. And of course, that would be a great way for you to participate with regard to super chats by just asking different applications of this, how to apply to Taiwan, how to apply to South Korea, how to apply to whatever, to Gaza, whatever you want to talk about. And how do you apply it? This might apply to America. How does this play into small countries? Small countries might not have an option but to negotiate with evil sometimes. Is that true? Why is that? And how do you deal with that? How do you deal with that? So let's talk about what a foreign policy looks like, and I'll start with defending the idea of America first as the standard in foreign policy, not America first as Trump advocates for it, as Trump promotes it, or as as anybody in the Trump administration really conceives of it, but America first as America first. That is a self-interested foreign policy. A foreign policy that takes the interests of America and applies them. So the first principle is the role of foreign policy is the protection of American interests, and only American interests. Its selfishness is applied to the state. But what are American interests? And this is key. America's interests cannot be separate, and they are not separate. The state has no interest separate from the individual rights of Americans. If you think about the American government and its one role, one purpose, according to Ayn Rand, and to some extent, although with not a full understanding of what that meant, the understanding of the Founding Fathers, the role of government is the protection of individual rights. At least that is clearly what is conveyed in the Declaration of Independence. A little less so maybe in the Constitution. So when I say American interests, that means the interests of American individuals, the rights of American individuals, the protection of those rights. Government doesn't intervene in commercial transactions. It doesn't intervene in competition. It shouldn't intervene in trade. We'll talk about that. All government does is protect rights. That's the fundamental. Everything else is a derivative. So, how do rights apply in an international setting? Well, they apply in the context that you have countries that might violate Americans' citizens' rights. They can violate those rights by killing them, hijacking an airplane, blowing it up, and that could happen anywhere in the world. They could violate those rights by invading the United States and violating the property rights of Americans and their right to life. They could violate those rights by stealing their property, by confiscating, nationalizing their property. Again, that could happen anywhere in the world. So the responsibility of the American government is basically the protection of the life and property of Americans. Now, for example, does that mean that the American government needs to protect the right of Americans for free speech? So they go to a country like England and they say something anti-Muslim, and England arrests them. And the answer is, probably not. Now, the American embassy in England should do everything it can, particularly in a case like this, to free the individual and should be there to support the individual, particularly with regard to an issue like free speech, and it, I think, should lodge a complaint with the Great Britain and argue that this is a violation of rights. But this is not something you go to war for. And indeed, even among free countries, there has to be an understanding among Americans that as they travel, they are beholden to the law of the countries in which they travel. So as long as it's within kind of the rule of law in those countries, if an American has to pay taxes in those countries, or even if through some regulatory shenanigans the country confiscates their property, but it's within the rule of law, then the U.S. government, I think, can protest, but would do very little about it. It should make it understood to its citizens that as they travel around the world, they are beholden to the laws of the countries in these different countries. Now, if an authoritarian regime basically wholesale confiscates the property of all Americans living there, or of American companies who've invested resources there, now that rises to a different level. This is outside the rule of law. It's an authoritarian regime. And indeed, if this is an event of significance, like the nationalization of oil happened in the 1950s and 1960s, certainly the United States could take action. And what that particular action would depend on the particular circumstances to protect the rights of these companies and these individuals. This is not in the framework of you're traveling, you're investing around the world in free countries, respect their rule of law, and work within it. They're basically free. Yeah, they're not as free as we are, but they're basically free. This goes above and beyond that this is a massive violation of rights. Now, you could argue, well, if you go into a place like Saudi Arabia of 100 years ago, 75 years ago, there are no rights to be protected, but then, they, particularly on a strategic asset like oil, there is some expectation that the U.S. government backs this, is supportive of this. And maybe that needs to be made explicit in a transaction. I think in the world in which we live today, I don't think companies would be investing like they did back then without an explicit guarantee from the U.S. government. But the main thing is to protect the lives of Americans from enemies, from people who would kill them, people who would invade America, or people who would commit terrorist attacks against Americans, people who would blow up embassies, blow up planes, shoot up gatherings of Americans, and kill Americans at any opportunities possible. And, so overall, the purpose is of the U.S. Foreign policy is to protect the lives of Americans. And to protect America from invasion. And I'd say one aspect of protecting property rights is, and this is unique to the perspective that the United States has as, if you will, a superpower, to protect the right of Americans to trade, to protect the sea lanes, to protect against piracy. It is interesting that the first war the United States as an independent country fought, the first military action it took, was thousands of miles away from the United States. It involved the pirates of the Mediterranean, Islamic pirates off the coast of what is today Libya and Algeria, who were raiding ships, confiscating their property, enslaving the people in the ships. And some of these ships were heading to America. Some of these ships were American ships. But this was interrupting trade with America. And Thomas Jefferson was having none of it. And note that America was a young republic. It wasn't a superpower. It didn't have an all-powerful military. And yet, Thomas Jefferson sent units of Marines halfway around the world into the Mediterranean in an era of sailing boats, landed those Marines on the coast, I think of Libya, rounded up the pirates and came to an agreement with them by defeating them that they would not touch ships bound from America. So trade, securing the shipping lanes, and make it possible for individuals to trade freely around the world. And a purpose of foreign policy, not necessarily of war, but of foreign policy, is to secure free trade. This is the travesty, well, an aspect of the travesty that is the tariffs and everything that Trump is doing. One of them, Ayn Rand defined maybe the main purpose of foreign policy is the securing free trade. She complimented the British Empire for its gunboat diplomacy that involved making sure that the ports of the world were open to British shipping, making sure that the ports of the world were open to trade with England. So, the United States should be going to every government in the world and encouraging them to reduce tariffs and trade barriers to zero. And the best way to do that is by doing it by example, is by lowering our own tariffs to zero. But instead, we get other countries to lower their tariffs to zero, and then we increase our tariffs on our people and tax our people at 15, 20, 30, 40%. This is nuts, irrational, anti-American. So, protecting Americans' right to trade, Americans' ability to, travel at least within the free world, protecting their lives as they travel in the world, and at scale at least, the protection of property rights. So, that is the purpose. Now, in order to do that, one of the most important principle from ethics that we can apply to foreign policy is the principle of justice. The principle of justice. The principle of justice says you must judge your fellow man. Judge the good and the evil, the positive and the negative. Embrace the positive, befriend the good, or support the good, trade with the good, and resist, disengage from evil. Stay away from evil. So the first thing that has to be done for a proper, rational foreign policy, I think, is to define who's good and who's not. And what are the standards? What's the criteria? Take a list of every country in the world. Who's good and who's not? Rank them on a basis of 1 to 10. I don't know. A free country is basically good. Free countries that are particularly friendly to America, that have zero tariffs with America, very good. Very, very good. Semi-free countries, mostly free countries that are friendly to America, yeah, they're good. Not great, very, very good, but good. Authoritarian regimes, they're bad. If they're friendly to America, they're only mildly bad. But if they're hostile to America, they're very bad. And if they're hostile with America and exhibiting all the signs that suggest that they would act on that hostility, they are the enemy. So one of the first things a president should do when coming to office is make up a list and define who's who. And I think I'm generally against government secrets. There are very few things that should be secret. The governments are our servants. They work for us. We should know about what they do and what they're thinking and why they're doing what they're doing. So like, yeah, you don't want the identity of spies disclosed. You don't want to give away intelligence, assets. But short of that, there should be no state secrets. So the United States should make a list and publicize it. I don't know, Great Britain is an 8. And, Russia's a 2 or 1 or 0. I don't know. Iran is a 1, 1 meaning evil and an enemy. North Korea, a 2, evil and an enemy. Russia's a 2, China's a 4. I don't know, whatever, right? Israel's a 7, 8. So, put out a scale, put out a list. And, different administrations can do it differently. They can have, Jennifer suggests, green, yellow, red countries. We can have green, yellow, red countries. I've suggested 3 different categories for diplomatic relations, and that I think applies. Friends, free countries, basically. So category 1 is not friends. Category 1 is free countries. Category 2 is unfree countries. And category 3 is unfree countries who are enemies. The smallest category is 3. There are not that many enemies of the United States anyway. There's a big category 2. And in my view, category 1 gets full diplomatic relations, defense of, complete free trade, mutual recognition, maybe even, in some cases, we'll get to this, defense treaties. Category 2 has no diplomatic recognition because you don't recognize the sovereignty of an unfree state, but no trade barriers, no restrictions on trade, generally open relationships, but no diplomatic relationship, no recognition, no moral sanction. And category 3 is the enemy. You don't trade. You boycott them completely. No trade, no diplomatic relationships, no contact, except to accept a surrender or to negotiate about things you have to. I don't know. You don't want to get into a nuclear war. If you can avoid it through negotiations, certainly that is worthwhile doing. Those would be the 3 categories, but within those categories you could have more red, less red, more green, less green, and so on. So the first thing is to apply justice. Who are the good guys, who are the bad guys? And they are good guys and they are bad guys. And, ask me about what the criteria would be, but it's not that hard. It's not that hard. Okay, once you do that, you've got to identify those countries or regimes that are currently posing a real threat to the lives of U.S. citizens and to America in terms of potential invasion, bombing, terrorism, whatever. And again, this list should be public. Off the bat, the easy ones are, Iran, killed many Americans, swears to kill more Americans, committed to killing more Americans, developing nuclear weapons with the hope of one day killing more Americans, dedicated to killing Americans. Not very powerful, not very strong, but it wants to kill Americans, responsible, funded terrorist attacks against Americans, and would do so again if it had the ability. North Korea has nuclear weapons, has ballistic missiles that can reach the United States, has threatened the United States, has threatened to use those weapons in the United States, is an authoritarian, totalitarian state, one of the worst in the world, maybe the worst in the world, totalitarian state, which is, by definition, not friends to us. But here it's hostile. It's explicitly hostile. That's 2 countries that are easy. Is Russia on this list? Is Russia clearly posing a threat to U.S. citizens? Maybe. This one you'd have to really dig deep. Clearly Russia is an authoritarian, run by an authoritarian thug. So it's not a free country. So it's certainly not green. But is it yellow or is it red? Well, it's expressed a willingness in action to invade other countries that are basically free. It's invaded Ukraine. It's invaded Georgia. So it is on the international scene. It has positioned itself as being willing to use force to achieve its aims. That is a huge red flag. It doesn't turn them red automatically, but it's a huge red flag, because if they're willing to do that to Ukraine and willing to do that to Georgia, why wouldn't they be willing to do that to the United States? And would they, in a conflict the United States might have entered, would they take the other side? Are they an active enemy of the United States? Are they seeking to hurt the United States in any way? And, Russia would have to be somewhere between red and yellow. Because of the invasion of Ukraine, I would tilt them more towards the red than of the yellow. But they're not like Iran. They haven't actively gone out and killed Americans. They haven't funded, as far as I know, and maybe I don't know, actively funded terrorism against the United States. So Russia's somewhere probably between yellow and red. But once you're in the red, once you're a country that is viewed as a threat to the lives of Americans, a number of things that have to happen. One, if possible, the threat must be immediately eliminated. Immediately eliminated. So whatever capacity they have to threaten American lives needs to be taken away from them. Now, when it comes to Iran, that is completely possible. If we deem the nuclear facilities a threat, they should be destroyed. All of them. Systematically. If we believe that they are funding terrorism that is targeted at Americans, then the regime must be toppled, or their economic ability to pose a threat against the United States needs to be eliminated, i.e., their oil industry needs to be blown up. That is, whatever the threat happens to be, and however seriously and however substantial you think that threat is, to that extent, that threat needs to be eliminated if possible, and I add if possible. It's a little bit more complicated with North Korea because they have nukes. So with North Korea, the solution might be develop a technology that makes it impossible for them to launch those nukes against you. There's a variety of things you could do. Knock them out of the sky before they reach above the atmosphere. Knock the facilities themselves out. But, if you're afraid that they might be able to launch a nuke against you, it might not be worth military action to eliminate the threat right now. And in that case, what you need to do is disengage, and this is true of the Iran situation, disengage, no trade. You cannot have trade with a country that wants to kill your citizens. So not sanctions. I don't believe in sanctions. I don't believe in tariffs. I believe in embargo. You don't trade. Zero trade. And maybe you even isolate them by stopping shipping in and out of North Korea. Every boat that leaves a North Korean port gets expropriated by an American Navy. And you isolate them, and you disengage them with them. And you prepare whatever technology you need to in order to make sure they can never launch against you. I like the idea of kind of an iron dome in the United States, a steel dome. I can't remember what Trump called it. But I think that is a good investment. I think the United States should invest in making sure no ballistic missile can enter the United States. Remember, the ballistic missiles trying to come to the United States will have nuclear warheads. You can't let 1% of them in. You can't let any of them in. So you need to develop a fail-safe method, a golden dome, I think you called it, right? And that might involve lasers in space. It might involve lasers on the ground. It might involve the kind of things Israel did. The advantage the United States has is that its enemies are very far away, but they also have better technology than Iran had. So the United States needs to really work on a technological dome that protects itself, a golden dome that protects it from ballistic missiles. But you disengage and you isolate. And here's the thing. between a country like the United States and North Korea, there should be no trade, no embassy, no relations, no negotiating, no meetings, no asks, no tit for tat, nothing. They don't exist. And if they try something, then you take them out. Now, let's say you identify Russia as an enemy. Well, it's an enemy you cannot eliminate the threat. You certainly cannot eliminate the threat before you have a Golden Dome. Because they have nukes, it's not worth engaging with them. But here is worth. It's worth isolating them. It's worth embargoing them. It's worth having no diplomatic relations with them. It's worth not meeting with them. It's worth not treating them as if they're a legitimate country. No trade, no embassy, no negotiations, no meeting their leaders, no invitation to any public forums, nothing. Treat them like the pariah that they are. And indeed, that should be done, even though they're somewhere between yellow and red. This is exactly how they should be treated. And in the case of Russia, since they clearly constitute a threat to NATO, they clearly are red vis-a-vis NATO, and we are members of NATO, and that means they're a threat to us, as long as we're members of NATO. Now, we can talk about whether we should or shouldn't be, but right now we are. Yeah, no sports teams, no playing with them, no Russian flag going up, no the foreign minister of Russia showing up in U.S. soil with a USSR shirt on. I mean, how disrespectful is that? How frigging disrespectful is that? If the United States had a shred of self-esteem, if the Trump administration had a shred of self-esteem, they would have asked the foreign minister of Russia to get on a plane and go home immediately. He should have never been invited, but and then, you can ask the question, how do you support Ukraine? How much do you support Ukraine? How do you support Ukraine? Again, I think if we had a proper foreign policy, Russia would have never invaded. To that extent, I agree with Trump. Not that I think he provides the proper foreign policy, but I think Russia invaded because of American weakness. If we weren't weak, they wouldn't have invaded. If they believed NATO was strong and united and would stand up to them, they wouldn't have invaded. All right, then you've got this yellow group. Well, maybe yellow-reddish. Yellow maybe becoming red, right? These are countries and regimes that might pose a threat to U.S. citizens in the future. They don't right now. But one, they're authoritarian, and authoritarian regimes can always potentially pose a threat. B, they might be nuclear, and they might be under the influence of an ideology that is fundamentally anti-U.S. or anti-Western, and therefore could easily pose a threat in the future, and therefore could become enemies. I mean, here I would think of Iran. Iran we've already covered. I think of China. Here I would think of Pakistan. You'd have to go through the different Arab countries, and some of them clearly would qualify here. They might not be an enemy right now, but they could easily switch. Now, none of them are really significant because they don't have nukes, they don't have a big military. It would be hard for them to really pose a threat, but look at Iran. And Qatar, for example, would be qualified here, right? It's funded terrorism against America. It was the main fund of ISIS. And it's the main fund of Hamas. So these are countries that you have almost no contact. You can trade with them. Americans can trade with them. But at their own risk, they get none of the protection from the U.S. government. There are no negotiations, except potentially the elimination of that potential risk that happens in the future. And if our allies are threatened by them, then we assist our allies to deal with them. But these are countries that don't yet pose a direct threat to the United States, therefore do not necessitate a direct military confrontation. They do not necessitate yet an embargo. But you want to tell your residents, your citizens, hey, you're trading with somebody who could become an enemy, you should think about it. And by the way, you're trading on your own. We're not going to protect your intellectual property rights. We're not going to protect it because they're an authoritarian regime. There is no rule of law over there. You're doing this at your own risk. This should have always been the idea with China. Yeah, you want to go to China, you want to invest in China, fine. But remember, can't protect you. Now, if a country tilts towards, well, now it's become a threat, then now you have to have no trade, an embargo. And you see, if businesses know that, if businesses know that this country's kind of yellow but tilting towards red, and we might define it as red in the future, they might not invest as much in countries like that. They might hesitate, and indeed countries like that who want American investment, who want American tech, might try to become less red and more yellow and move towards the green. So you provide an incentive by making it public and explaining exactly what happens at every phase. You give them an incentive if they want trade with America, and most countries do, even the authoritarian ones. You provide them an incentive to move in the right direction, to get better, to become better. They'll have a relationship. We'll be much more open to trade. We'll negotiate. We'll have contact. We'll have an embassy. But you have to move in that other direction. And again, assisting allies here is really, really important, because one of the things that will distract a potential enemy from becoming one is if they have other challenges, countries that are challenging them and therefore distracting them. So I think it's important for us to support Ukraine so that Russia does not have time, energy, resources to focus on us. I think it's important for us to arm Taiwan and South Korea and Japan so that China has to think twice about going after us because it has to deal with them right in their backyard. You have to be strategic. You have to really think about strategically. And then, as importantly, one has to identify the dark greens, our allies. And here, our allies, particularly the dark green allies, the real allies, the committed allies, the long-run allies, are going to be free countries. So here in today's world, Europe, much of Europe at least, countries like South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and Australia, potentially India, New Zealand, I'm thinking of Asia. Those are solid allies. Those are long-term allies. Those are countries that we should really consider having defense treaties with. In the Middle East, of course, Israel would be the only country. And with those countries, we should consider defense treaties, both vis-a-vis known enemies like China and Asia and Russia and Europe, and unknown enemies or potential future enemies like various terrorist organizations. And then we might also have temporary allies. Allies that we know are not dark green. They're not real allies. They're not fully committed. They're not free, necessarily as free. We don't know long-term whether they're going to be on our side. These are temporary alliances that we might form in order to deal with a particular threat. So you might think of, some Arab countries in some contexts as allies in facing the Iranian threat. Although it's not clear to me we need allies to face Iran. Iran is so weak. So think about this in Asia. Think about maybe Indonesia and Malaysia, and maybe even Vietnam. as temporary allies. Vietnam is not a free country. We would not have open, complete friendly alliance with them. I don't think we should have an alliance with Saudi Arabia. I think they're not the enemy. We have an arm's length relationship with Saudi Arabia, but I think we treat Saudi Arabia as as what they deserve, which is they're the bad guys. Now, they're not the bad guys so that they're a threat. They're not. They're not the bad guys in terms they pose a threat to any of our allies. They mostly don't. But they're bad guys in terms of the fact that they are a threat to their own people. They are not free. They have no respect for individual rights. And they cannot be trusted. They cannot be trusted. So they might be a temporary ally in a particular confrontation, but certainly not a long-term ally. Certainly not a country that the first country our president goes to visit when he goes international. Certainly not we dance with them, we hug them, we befriend them. No. Arm's length. Arm's length. They're a thuggish regime, and we have to make our moral stance about them known. Judge. And in Saudi Arabia, atheists go to jail. Adulterers get stoned to death. It's not the kind of regime, and it's run by a king. We don't believe in kings. So I don't think we need to do anything about it. I just don't think we need to be the best friends either. And we certainly don't need to give them security guarantees. And if we need, I don't know what exactly we need from them, right? Particularly today when we don't need their energy. I don't think Kuwait would be a friend. Again, a temporary, short-term, momentary ally in a conflict, but not a friend. Again, they're thuggish. They're authoritarian. They're this close to being Islamist. Now, if we want, we can encourage them to be less Islamist, and as they become less Islamist, we can be more friendly. But I think we need to take a moral stand in the world. If you don't respect individual rights within your country, you are bad. Not as bad, and not a threat to us, so we're not you're not hostile to us, so we're not in an enemy position. But you are bad, and we will identify you as such. Not embargo, trade, free trade, that's good. So you can imagine mutual defense treaties with allies in Pacific Rim, in Europe, to contain China, to contain Russia. I don't think you need one in the Middle East, because I think Iran could be eliminated within days, as Israel showed us. And I don't know what other region of the world you need an alliance. The United States, because of how weak almost all its enemies are, can deal with any one of them by itself. Now, maybe North Korea, it's good to have South Korea on our side, and that would be part of the anti-Chinese alliance, but it would also be part of an anti-North Korean alliance, but that's about it. And then finally, I did want to say something about Pakistan. Pakistan is just a bewildering country because Pakistan has nukes. It is Islamist in many respects. It's not an Islamist country. It doesn't impose Sharia law, but it has strong Islamist elements. And there are people who would like to impose Sharia law in totality. You have real Islamists, very close to power, and many of them are in the military, which controls the nuclear weapons. It's hostile fundamentally, philosophically to the West. Now, not everybody in Pakistan. Pakistan has this strong influence of the British Empire from colonial times. But that influence does not dominate, certainly not in the military, and doesn't seem to be in its politics. And yet, the United States is unbelievably friendly towards Pakistan. We send them weapons. We constantly grovel before them. We since 9/11, before 9/11, every administration. I think, again, a principled position in this part of the world should be India is a relatively free country. India is moving towards more freedom. India is our ally. Pakistan is an enemy. Maybe not an enemy, but Pakistan is a potential one-day enemy. It has nukes. We need to be able to neutralize those nukes. We need to be in a position to be able to eliminate any kind of ballistic missile with a range that can reach the United States. I don't think Pakistan has ICBMs yet, but I think they're developing them. So we need to make sure they don't. And we need to take a clear moral stance between India and Pakistan, based on the kind of governments they have, based on the respect they have for individual rights. Now, Pakistan is not a completely authoritarian place. It's just a mess, but it's not an ally. What's funny about Trump right now is that he is alienating India and befriending Pakistan. And that makes zero sense to me. Zero sense. And he's pushing India in the direction of Russia. And ultimately, Pakistan is going to be aligned with China. So there's zero reason to alienate India, even if it is close to Russia. We need to make it in India's interests not to be close to Russia. And I think if we weren't so friendly with Pakistan, I think that would happen. Trump in particular is friendly with Pakistan. I think Pakistan has nominated Trump for a Nobel Peace Prize, which is, if you want aid, and India did not support it. Pakistan supported it for Trump's help in getting a ceasefire between India and Pakistan, and India did not support it. And that's all it is, right? We didn't talk about this when we talked about Putin and Trump, but all Trump cares about is the stupid Nobel Prize. He doesn't care about peace. And he knows that Kissinger got the Nobel Prize for a peace deal that was violated within months and from his getting the prize, and resulted in South Vietnam being run over by North Vietnam, defeated by North Vietnam very easily. And he still got the Nobel Prize for peace, even though he didn't establish peace. Well, Trump knows this. So he knows that the Nobel Prize is about short-term success, not about long-term. So he just needs to get something so that the committee can vote him a Nobel Peace Prize. Anyway, those would be the principles I would apply to foreign policy. That would be the way I would apply them. I am happy to discuss different applications of this. If you guys have any questions in the super chat,